I would like to speak today about why I believe Israel is not a democracy. I'd like to show 5 reasons why it is not a democracy. And I would like to show or play some radio interviews, one with the previous Prime Minister Ehud Olmert, which he doesn't outright say it's not a democracy, but what he says bolster what I say, that Israel is not a democracy. The same thing with Shlomo Kari, who is a Israeli Likud Knesset member. He claims that Israel is a democracy in the interview, but what he says actually demonstrate that Israel is not a democracy. I think that it's important to understand that Israel is not a democracy because a lot of time Israel claims that it is a democracy. Many governments, especially the United States, claim that they support Israel because it's the only democracy in the Middle East and because it provides stability in the Middle East. I think it's just not true. Israel is not a democracy and it is not a stable government, and I intend to show that. And the reason I am saying all of that is because I think that the only way to provide stability is to create a true democracy, which includes the Israelis and the Palestinian together, side by side, because I don't think that it is possible to dismantle the Israeli government or the Palestinian government. So we have to come up with the best solution, given that the Israeli government and the Palestinian government, including Hamas government, are there to remain. And they're not going to be dismantled. The best way to do that is to create a common government for the people of Israel and Palestine that would exist parallel to those 3 governments or 2 governments. It will be parallel, but completely separate and will work independently of the Israeli and the Palestinian government. So let me start with the 5 reasons. I just want to apologize ahead of time. I will be playing audio from audio recording from a radio interviews with the Prime Minister and the Knesset member. The audio is of poor quality. I know that ahead of time because I played it to myself. And but nevertheless, I think it's important to authenticate what I am saying and to show what I'm. So bear with me during the recording. It's in Hebrew, and I have the English translation. So bear with me. I was told that if I get 1,000 subscribers to this channel, I will be getting like 4 hours of free video assistance. And so if you can tell your friends and if you can subscribe, that would be great. It will get me closer to 1,000. I think right now I'm at 7 subscribers. So, but hope is eternal. So let me start by giving the reasons why Israel is not a democracy. My name is Joseph Avasar, and I was born in Israel. My parents were born in Iraq. They came to Palestine in 1936. They arrived to Palestine as a couple with my older brother, who is still alive, in 1936. And my dad was a Zionist. My mom was not a Zionist, but I think she became a Zionist later on. But my dad was a Zionist from Iraq. He learned about Zionism, about Theodore Herzl, while he was a young person in Iraq. And that inspired him to move to Palestine. So that it's clear, he was not pushed out of Palestine. In his memoirs, he actually said that based on everything he says, that life was good in Iraq, but he visited Palestine 5 years or 4 years before he immigrated to Palestine. And he likes the openness of Tel Aviv, the fact that people go to the beach. He likes the fact that there is Hebrew writing on the streets. And that inspired him, and he applied for a visa, and he got a visa from the British to immigrate to Palestine. So he came in first in 1931, and then he came in subsequently with my mother and my older brother in 1936 to Palestine. I studied political science at UCLA. I got my bachelor's degree after I immigrated from Israel. So I had my initial education, my elementary and high school education, and the military in Israel. And then I got my bachelor's degree from UCLA. And then I studied law at Southwestern University. And I have been practicing law for 40 years, ever since I got my license. I did some constitutional law. I studied constitutional law in law school. I enjoyed that very much. I was always an admirer of Constitution. And I think that the Constitution is important for a country to have a fair and honest Constitution. That's what I'll be speaking about today. I am also the founder of the Israeli Palestinian Confederation. You can read about it or watch it on ipconfederation.org. And you can also email me at josephavassar@gmail.com. So to hear from you. Let me start with a dictionary definition of a democracy. Government by the people, that form of government in which the sovereign power resides in the people as a whole and is exercised either directly by them or by officers elected by them. So the critical word here, that it's by the people and they elect people to represent them. And that's generally the definition of democracy. Merriam-Webster defined it similarly. I believe that Israel is not a democracy. I believe that Israel is an ethnocracy. Ethnocracy is a political structure in which the state apparatus is controlled by a dominant ethnic group to further its interest, power, and resources. And I think that suits the definition of Israel. It is not a democracy. It's a political structure, mostly it started by a dominant ethnic group, which is a Jewish group, to further its own interest and power and resources. It's important that we have some background. In the 18th century and the 19th century and the 20th century, there was a lot of anti-Semitism in Europe and Russia, mostly in Europe and Russia. Not much, if any, in the Muslim world, but mostly in Europe and Russia. And that's where the Jews suffered a lot of pogroms. Pogroms, for those of you who are not familiar, are events in which sometimes supported by the government, sometimes people on their own would come to villages in which Jews would reside, and they just do a lot of criminal activities, rape, a lot of destruction of property, very, very violent events against Jews. And that happened mostly in Russia mostly in Russia, but also in Europe. And that's in the end of the 18th century, the 19th century. And of course, we had the Holocaust. The Holocaust is happened at the starting in the 1930 of the 20th century, where the Nazis took over Germany. They were very racist, and they were racist against Jews, but not only Jews, but mostly against Jews. They saw Jews as an inferior race, and they felt that it is necessary to destroy the Jews or to kill them in order to save the world from this inferior race. So what they've done is they had a systematic killing of Jews in concentration camps, gassing them, shooting them, putting them in trains and shipping them to concentration camps, Auschwitz, etc. And 6 million Jews were murdered. So this is the background of the creation of the State of Israel. So the pogroms and the Holocaust was the foundation of Zionism. Basically, the person in the picture is Theodor Herzl. He is considered to be the head of Zionism, the person who envisioned Zionism. And basically, his theory was that Jews are not going to have a future in Europe and Russia, that anti-Semitism will always remain, and Jews have no future there. And therefore, because of the racism and anti-Semitism against Jews, they have no future and they need to move to a place of their own. Eventually, it was decided that it would be in Palestine. The word Zion means Israel in the Bible. So he did not really point to Palestine at the beginning. He was considering other places like Argentina and Africa, etc. But mostly the Jews from Russia insisted that it has to have a biblical connotation, a biblical roots, and therefore he agreed that it would be Zion, and that's how the creation of the theory or the philosophy of Zionism. Zionism is basically at the root of the creation of the State of Israel, and it is part of its philosophy and beliefs to this day. So because of Zionism, because of the Holocaust and all and the pogroms, and the decision to create a Jewish state, and eventually at the Jewish state in Palestine, that was the decision, to create a Jewish state. So those who envisioned, the fathers of the state of Israel, envisioned a Jewish state. That's what Ben-Gurion, who was the first prime minister of Israel, he said it will be a Jewish state. They did not really envision a democratic state. Their first priority, their first intention, and probably the only intention, was to create a Jewish state. I don't think that they thought about the nature of the state. That came later. But the reason they wanted a Jewish state is because they had an instinctive trust of Jewish leaders, obviously because of the Holocaust and the pogroms. They said, well, Jewish leaders will protect us. We can trust them. So that was part of the idea of a Jewish state, is to have Jewish leaders. And the other philosophy of a Jewish state was, in order to have a Jewish state, you need to reduce the Palestinian population and increase the Jewish population. That was their philosophy, and it remains the philosophy today. All of these three elements, instinctive trust of Jewish state, reduce Palestinian population, increase Jewish population, that's still the philosophy of the state of Israel today. And it has been a philosophy of Zionism for the last over 100 years. So this brings me to my first argument, why Israel is not a democracy. Israel is not a democracy. The first reason is because it doesn't have a constitution. Now, a constitution is a piece of paper. It's not because it doesn't have a piece of paper to write the Constitution. It's because what's a Constitution basically define the nature of the state, how it would be created, how it would maintain itself, how it would function. That's what the Constitution is, a blueprint. So, a lot of people say, well, there are other countries with no constitution. I agree, there are other countries with no constitution. It's not only the Constitution, it's the spirit of what the Constitution says. And the reason it's important is because when you write the Constitution, you commit yourself to certain spirit and certain beliefs, how you want the country to function, and if there is a consensus. So usually when you have a constitution, the Constitution spells out things like equal protection, meaning everyone is equal. Well, a Jewish state cannot have a constitution in which everyone is equal, because by definition, a Jewish state means that Jews are superior, that Jews are above other people. So a constitution in a Jewish state you cannot write a constitution and appears to be fair and democratic without including a clause about equal protection or due process. Due process meaning that you give the process when you take the liberty or the life from someone, you have to give him the process that he's due, and it has to be equal. And when you take his property, you have to give him equal due process. Well, in a Jewish state, you can't do that, because part of what was done in a Jewish state is basically reduce the number of Palestinians into creating them as refugees and taking their property. So you cannot have a due process for individual rights when you, in a Jewish state that basically says that they don't have equal rights or individual rights or due process. So you can't write a constitution without that. Usually in a constitution, you talk about separation between government and religion. If you claim to be a democracy, a constitution would say, well, we are separating between religion and government. You can't do that in a Jewish state, because a Jewish state, the essence of a Jewish state is no separation between religion and government. Usually in a democracy, you talk about equal right to vote. Well, you cannot say that in a Jewish state, because in a Jewish state, right now, for instance, Israel does not give the Palestinian the right to vote, the Palestinian in the West Bank, Gaza, and Jerusalem, but it controls them. So they don't have an equal right to vote, and that's why you cannot include that in the Constitution in a Jewish state. So another thing in a Constitution, you usually talk about three branches of government: the executive, the judicial, and the legislative. In Israel, they do claim to have that, but as I'll show, that's not really true. And you need to talk about term limits. That those two sometimes are included in the Constitution and sometimes are not. But equal protection, due process, separation between religion and government is necessary if you want to write a constitution. So Israel does not have a constitution because it does not want to outright ignore in a constitution those basic rights. So it cannot write a constitution. You cannot really write a constitution in a Jewish state without appearing completely racist on your own document. So the other thing about the Constitution is that what Israel done is because it realizes it doesn't have a constitution and it wants to give some sort of appearance that it is a fair country and wants to please its own citizens who are wondering, why are we not having a constitution, not really getting deeply into the issue in a Jewish state, because they don't realize that you cannot have a constitution in a Jewish state without appearing racist on its face. So Israel created its own system or its own laws, and they call it fundamental laws. So basically they pass laws and they give it the title of fundamental laws, which means that they are kind of like above regular laws, although it's not really clear what makes it above, other than the Israeli legislature, the Knesset, call it fundamental law. The problem is that the Israeli fundamental laws are created by the Knesset. But the Knesset is the legislative branch. But the whole purpose of having a constitution is, or one of the main purposes for having a constitution, is to protect the public from the Knesset, to protect the public, the Knesset not being able to pass certain laws that violates the Constitution. Now, the Constitution is protecting the public from the legislature, but the fundamental laws, they do the opposite. What they do is they protect the Knesset, the legislator, from the public. They basically say, we will decide what's basic laws and what's not. We will decide what protection the public deserves, and we will make sure, in this case, that the fundamental laws do not apply so broadly that Palestinians could use it against Israel. So the fundamental laws are basically created to give the impression that Israel is a democracy without having a constitution. But their total function, or their function, is opposite of a constitution, because it gives the legislator protection, because they're the one who write it, rather than the constitution being separate and independent from the legislator. So one of the things that the Knesset would do would preserve in its fundamental laws its right to pass certain laws that violates what we all understand is a democracy, such as creating religious laws that violates the whole purpose of secular democracy. The second reason why Israel is not a democracy is because it states that it is a Jewish state, a Jewish democracy. A Jewish state, or any religious state, doesn't matter if it's Jewish or Muslim or Christian, by its own nature, contradict the principle of democracy. Because democracy is meant to allow the representative to think on their own. They don't have to go to the religion and ask their opinion, or they don't have to be obligated to a certain religious belief. The whole purpose of a democracy is to say, well, let's think of our own. Let's have a free marketplace of ideas. And a Jewish democracy basically removes that. It eliminates that. So it creates more and more, and we see that in Israel, more and more loyalty to the religion. And it creates a conflict of interest between the legislator, the Knesset member, and his religion. And his loyalty is more to the religion. So there is a conflict of interest, and therefore it's not a democracy. In other words, Jewish democracy or Christian democracy or Muslim democracy is an oxymoron. It's the opposite of a democracy. The third reason why Israel is not a democracy is because it has 5 million Palestinians that are excluded from voting. Usually in a democracy, the voters choose the government. They decide who the government will be. But in Israel, as a Jewish democracy, it's the opposite. The government decides who the voters will be. So in Israel and Palestine, the government says, well, we are choosing that the voters will be 100% Jewish and some non-Jews. But the Palestinians that are under our control, 5 million of them, in Israel, in the West Bank, Gaza, and Jerusalem, 5 million that control, and Israel does control Gaza, controls the air, the sea, the economy, the infrastructure, and the borders. So Israel is saying, well, we are not giving you the status of being a citizen. And therefore, because you don't have that status, you don't have the right to vote. So we choose for you not to be a citizen, and we choose for you not to be able to vote for us because we know you're going to vote against us. So Israel population is 9 million people, Israelis, but it controls 5 million in the West Bank and Gaza, and it says, you are not citizen, you cannot vote. And it controls those people now for over 53 years. So, and they haven't been able to vote for 53 years. So a democracy that, a government that claims to be a democracy cannot do so by precluding people from voting. The fourth reason why Israel is not a democracy is because there is no separation between the legislative and the executive branch. What do I mean by that? In a democracy, you need to have the legislative branch separate from the executive branch. The branch that makes the laws separate from the branch that execute the laws. You don't want the people who execute the laws also make the laws, because then that's a totalitarian government. Why? Because, you know, if a king says, well, I want to conquer this country and I'll make the laws to do that, then that's not democracy. If I want whatever he wants, he cannot just pass laws to do that. So you have to have free decisions, free consideration by the legislature, the branches that makes the laws, to decide what's good for the country. Not what's good for them personally, but what's good for the country. Because they are not going to, if it's a separate system, the legislative branch, if it's separate, it's not going to benefit. It cannot benefit from passing its own legislation. So it can, because once it passes the legislation, it goes to the other branch, and the other branch execute. But in Israel, true, they claim to have a legislative branch and executive branch. The problem is, it's the same people. Most or all of the people that are in the executive branch are also in the legislative branch. The most powerful people in the legislative branch are also in the executive branch. They're the one who control both, and they're the one who pass the laws, and they're the one who benefit. And I'll talk about how that creates a conflict of interest. So the people that are in the Knesset, that are also in the government, are mostly the enabler of the prime minister. The star, up to now, and I don't know if they changed government or not, but usually each party has a star. Netanyahu, Bennett, Lapid. The rest of the people, he or she, are not popular. They're not very well known. So the heads of the party, the people who make the coalition, they basically choose who the rest of the people in the party, in the government would be, or in the legislature. And those that are chosen always protect the leader. And that's what's so dangerous about having them both in the legislative and the executive, because they have a conflict of interest being in both, and they also have internal conflict of interest because they want to remain in both the executive and the legislative. And they're the most powerful. So in reality, what I am arguing is that, and you'll see that in the next recording, in reality, the prime minister has tremendous amount of power because he's both powerful in the executive and the legislative. And that creates not only conflict of interest, but also lack of transparency, which is an essential element in a democracy, is to have transparency, because the public needs to know what's happening here. And when you are controlling the executive and the legislative branch, you do not allow the public to have transparency of what's going on. You don't, because basically it's the same people. So that's the fourth reason why I would like to start playing a audio recording by Prime Minister Ehud Olmert. And let me give you some background on him. He was the Prime Minister of Israel before Netanyahu. He was charged with corruption. I believe that the corruption that he was charged with was not because of conduct, while being the Prime Minister. But nevertheless, towards the end of his tenure, Netanyahu called for his resignation due to corruption. And he resigned, he was convicted, and he spent time in prison, I believe more than a year, for corruption. But this interview, which took place on March 25th, 2021, the part that I'm going to play to you for you was at the end of the interview. It was a heat of the moment interview, and Netanyahu, Olmert and Netanyahu are arch enemies. Now I think they're suing each other, but Olmert is calling Netanyahu corrupt. He's calling him the head of a crime family. Very, very ugly terms against Netanyahu, which may be right or wrong, but that's what Olmert is calling Netanyahu. Keep in mind those two dates. This recording that I'm going to play for you of the interview took place on March 25th, 2021. That's almost a month and a half before the recent war between Israel and Gaza, and the events in Jerusalem, which started in May 2021. So he's talking about what Netanyahu could be doing as a prime minister in order to avoid, and by the way, I forgot to mention, Netanyahu is also on trial for corruption recently. So Olmert is disclosing that Netanyahu could do certain things to personally benefit him as a prime minister. Now, he knows best. He was the prime minister. So he's talking about this, what would be coming, which eventually did come. And he's accusing him, Olmert is accusing Netanyahu of manipulating events for personal needs. So hopefully I know the recording is bad, and so bear with me on the English, on the Hebrew, and I have the translation in English. So let me play that. This is where the part that I'm interested began. I had a little bit before.
עוד דקה, בבקשה, בוא נעשה את המאמץ, אבל תראה, ממש מודה לכם, כן. אנחנו בעוד כמה ימים, 5 באפריל, נפתח השלב המשמעותי של משפט נתניהו. עכשיו, אתה עצמך יודע מניסיונך איזה משאבים נפשיים, פיזיים, גורר משפט פלילי. האם אתה רואה איזשהו תסריט שנתניהו מצליח לנהל את המדינה בד בבד שהוא צריך 3 פעמים בשבוע להתייצב ברחוב סלאח א-דין במחוזי ירושלים?
So he's asking him, and I hope you heard it, but he said he's asking him how much resources, emotional resources, he needed for this kind of trial that Netanyahu is going through.
נתניהו לא מנהל את המדינה כבר כמה שנים. כל מה שהוא עושה הוא רק מנהל את העניינים שרלוונטיים למה שנדמה לו שיכול לחלץ אותו מה-5 לאפריל. והוא ימשיך גם בזמן ההתנהלות המשפט לעשות רק את אותם דברים שיכולים לעזור לו. הוא לא יכול לנהל את העניין. אני לא יכול להעיד מסיבה אחת, כי שאתה יודע, אני פתרתי הרבה לפני שהוגש נגדי כתב אישום בכלל. הוחלט להעמיד אותי לדין. לא רציתי להעמיד את מדינת ישראל ואת הממשלה ואת כל מעמד ראש הממשלה במצב שהוא בכהונתו מועמד לדין, והיות וידעתי שזאת תהיה החלטה, בכל מקרה התפטרתי. אז אני לא יודע איך זה, כשאני ניהלתי את המשפט לא הייתי בתפקיד. אבל ברור שזה דורש משאבים עצומים מבחינה נפשית והקדשת זמן וכדומה. הוא ימשיך לעשות כל דבר כדי לדחות את המשפט ולחבל בהתנהלות הסדירה שלו. ועכשיו הוא יגיד, עכשיו צריך להקים ממשלה, איך אני יכול לבוא לבית משפט וכל מיני דברים כאלה, ואני לא יודע מה תהיה תגובת השופטים. אני די מוטרד מהשחיקה שנעשית במעמד בתי המשפט, זה לא דבר פשוט. לדעתי, יעשה כל מיני דברים, והוא עלול לעשות דברים ברמה המדיניתית, מתוקף התפקיד שלו כראש ממשלה בשלב הזה.
So he's basically saying, I think that it's huge emotional toll on a person who, a prime minister, but Netanyahu hasn't really been working as a prime minister. That's what Olmert is saying. And then he's saying he meaning Netanyahu, would do whatever he can to help him on a private matter. And then he's saying, I am concerned about the erosion of the court system. And we'll talk about that later, about the erosion of the court system. So now the interviewer is saying this.
אתה אומר דבר מאוד חמור, אהוד, מה אתה אומר? שהוא יכול להשתמש במצבנו הביטחוני למשל? שמעת טוב מה שאני אומר. לחמם את הגזרה בצפון למשל, גם בדרום וגם בצפון. גם בצפון וגם בדרום וגם במזרח. זה דברים חמורים מאוד, אתה אומר. אני אומר, ראית מה שעשה לפני 3 שבועות. בגלל שירדן הודיעה שהיא לא מאפשרת איזה שימוש במרחב האווירי שלה לנסיעתו, אז הוא שקלה את המרחב האווירי בין ישראל לבין ירדן. אתה מאשים ראש ממשלה בכך שיכול להשתמש בצה"ל לצרכים אישיים? לסכן את ביטחוננו? אין בכלל ספק בעניין הזה. כן, אני מאשים בהחלט, אני אומר את זה בצורה הכי ברורה. אבל צריך לזכור שזה העשור הביטחוני הכי שקט, בכל זאת. בכל זאת אפשר לומר, וצריך לציין, שיש בכל זאת בתקופת נתניהו כמה הסכמי שלום, ועשור ביטחוני די שקט, נאמר לשון המעטה. תראו, אתם מתעלמים מן העובדה שחזר עליה מי שהיה סגן ראש המוסד, תגיד רבים, אבל אני טוען את זה גם כן, שמה שקרה בסוריה בעשור האחרון, והעובדה שמדינת ישראל נכשלה בכך שאפשרה לאיראנים להיכנס עם כוח צבאי עם אמצעי לחימה שיכולים לפגוע בכל נקודה בישראל לתוך סוריה, בקרבת הגבול שלנו, זה כישלון ביטחוני חמור. מתנהלים כל הזמן אירועים ביטחוניים.
So basically what they are saying what Albert is saying in their interview is, yeah, I am accusing him that he will do whatever it takes. So they asked him, are you saying that he will use the Israeli military for his own purposes? And he said, yes, absolutely. He will use his own military, the military for his own personal. And they said, and are you saying it would be in the south? Yes, in the south, that's Gaza. In the north, that's Lebanon and Hezbollah and Syria. And in the east, that's Iran. So basically, Olmert, the previous prime minister, says that Netanyahu will use the military for his own purposes. Now, the purpose of of bringing this recording is not to tell you that Netanyahu is corrupt, although it appears to be that he is, but to demonstrate that what I said earlier, and that is that the prime minister, the head of the executive branch, and also the most influential person in the legislative branch, could do whatever he wants, including engaging in military war for his own personal benefit. That means there is no transparency. And that bolstered what I said, that there is no separation between the executive and the legislative. And the prime minister is basically a totalitarian, just like Putin, just like Erdogan, and they all have lack of transparency and conflict of interest, and they can do almost whatever they want. Not totally, but almost. Now, the fifth reason why Israel is not a democracy is because it doesn't have an independent Supreme Court. Now, an independent Supreme Court, it means that it is not created by the Constitution. It is created by the Knesset. And I'll play you an interview with Shlomo Kari on that point exactly. If there is no Constitution, and if the Constitution does not create a Supreme Court, then the Supreme Court is not independent. And if it's not independent, it's constantly being curtailed and constantly being threatened. So let me play to you an interview now with Knesset member Shlomo Kari, which took place on May 31st, 2021. Now, before I play that, I just want to emphasize one thing. Shlomo Kari is a Knesset member from the Likud. If you go around and ask Israelis, who is Shlomo Kari, I would bet you that most people would not know who he is. In fact, I didn't know who he was until I heard the radio interview that blew my mind. He is a Knesset member in the Likud. He would not be elected, in my opinion, ever, if it wasn't for Netanyahu. He is an enabler of Netanyahu. He is not independently popular. In fact, he's not known. And he's talking about the relationship between the Supreme Court and the legislative, the Knesset. And he's basically saying in the interview, the Knesset controls the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has to do what the Knesset tells it. And from his perspective, and based on reality, he's correct. The Israeli Supreme Court is not independent. It is a creation of the Knesset. The Knesset prescribed to it what its jurisdiction and what laws it can pass. And he is complaining that the Supreme Court is rupturing the framework of the authority given to it by the Knesset. So let me play you this. It's, in my opinion, it's it establishes it completely what I said about the Supreme Court not being independent, even worse than that.
עוד עניין אחד חשוב, חבר הכנסת קרעי, כיוון שאתה איתנו, שנשמע קטע מהדברים של נשיאת בית המשפט העליון, השופטת אסתר חיות, היום בכנס לשכת עורכי הדין באילת, בו נשמע את השופטת חיות. דומני, כי כאשר נבחר ציבור כזה או אחר, מרשה לעצמו לתאר פסק דין של בית המשפט כאירוע מטורף, ציטוט, או כהפיכה, ציטוט, הדברים מלמדים יותר על אומרם מאשר על בית המשפט שנתן את פסק הדין. ישנם נבחרי ציבור המגדילים לעשות ומרשים לעצמם לקרוא לאי כיבוד ואי ציות לפסקי דין שאינם לרוחם. בקריאות חסרות האחריות הללו תמונה סכנה גדולה אשר חשוב להתריע מפניה ולומר באופן ברור ביותר. חתירה תחת הלגיטימיות של בתי המשפט ושל פסקי הדין הניתנים על ידם חותרת למעשה תחת עקרון שלטון החוק ומכאן דעת אנרכיה וכאוס קצר המרחק.
So before, I mean, the interview was started before, but in this portion of the interview, they play for him what the head justice of the Supreme Court says, which is that she is condemning those politicians who call upon the public to ignore the decisions of the Supreme Court or of the courts. So, and that's been done all the time, even in a democracy where there is a constitution. But let me go on to the interview and you'll see exactly what I am referring to. So the interviewer is saying, well, these are strong words that the judge is saying. And this is what the Knesset member, Kari, is saying.
אהרון ברק לפני 30 שנה, עכשיו היא מרגישה שזה הולך לקרות, שנבחרי הציבור הולכים להיות כולם תת-עלה של אותם מספר מועט של שופטי בג"ץ שלא נבחרו מעולם על ידי הציבור, ואין להם שום איזונים מוליים. אז אין לו מטרה. זה כבר התחיל לפני 30 שנה. לפני 30 שנה, של אהרון ברק, לא, לאחרונה הדבר הזה התחיל להתגבר יותר ויותר, עד כדי שראינו שבוע שעבר, ביטול חוק יסוד.
So, Kari, the Knesset member, says, before I address the substance of the matter of what she said, what is happening now is judicial coup, which was started by her protege, Aharon Barak. That was the previous, a head justice, Supreme Court justice, sometimes 30 years ago. Now she feels that it is going to happen. In other words, the coup. She feels that the coup is going to happen. That the public servants are going to be tatale, meaning followers of these minor number of judges who were never elected by the public and have no other countermeasures. So he's basically complaining about her, saying that she has no, she's trying to create a coup. Well, that happens even in many democracies in the Constitution. The legislator usually accused the judges of a coup or attempted coup. That's not new, and that's not the point I'm trying to make. And then he says, it happened 30 years ago. The judicial coup began by Aharon Barak, that's the other 30 years ago judge. And recently it increased more and more, so much So that last week we saw the cancellation of basic law. So he's saying, why are they canceling? What authority do they have to cancel basic law? We didn't give them that authority. We are the Knesset. We did not give them that authority to cancel laws. So he's saying, where does the Supreme Court get its power to cancel basic laws of the legislative body? No such thing happened in democracy in the world. Well, it does happen, but he is right. From his perspective, they didn't give the Supreme Court the power, and there is no constitution. He believes that the Supreme Court has to follow literally the laws that were prescribed to them by the Knesset. And from his perspective, he is right, because there is no constitution. I am not arguing with him. I am demonstrating that Israel does not have a constitution, and he validates that Israel does not have a constitution. And basically, he validates what I said, and that is that the prime minister is the head of the legislative body, or the most important person in the legislative body, and his parties are the most important party, and they're the one who make the laws. And he's the one, the executive, and they also control the Supreme Court. In other words, the prime minister has tremendous amount of power, not what's understood to be in a democracy. Let me play you more.
שלא צריך לקיים החלטות של שופטים? אני חושב שצריך לסגור את בג"ץ. אתה עורך דין.
So the interviewer asked him, do you think there is no need to obey decisions made by judges? And Kari says, I think we should shut down the Supreme Court. Okay, a lot of democracies believe that, but the reason they cannot shut down the Supreme Court is because the Supreme Court is equal to them. It's part of the Constitution, but in Israel, there is no Constitution. So the interviewer said, well, you're a lawyer. He said, no, I'm not a lawyer. I'm an engineer, and I am an accountant. And I have enough knowledge to know that this thing of cancellation of laws by the Supreme Court doesn't happen anywhere in the world. Well, he's wrong. It does happen. But that's not the point. The point is that he totally believes, and correctly from his perspective, that the Supreme Court is the creation of the parliament, of the Israeli parliament, and they have to abide by the parliament. They cannot cancel the laws of the parliament. That's what makes Israel not a democracy. So the other interviewer said, are you out of your mind? You think that we should close the Supreme Court? It's going to lead to total anarchy. But his response is more important, more interesting. He said, I have the authority, meaning I, as the legislator, I have the authority to close down the Supreme Court, to shut it down, which means that he is totally intimidating the Supreme Court, which means that he is in control of the Supreme Court, which means that Netanyahu, or the prime minister, is in control of the Supreme Court, who is also in control of the parliament, who is also in control of the executive. And that makes him almost a totalitarian.
הפך להיות, הגולם קם על יוצרו ומחליט שהוא עושה מה שהוא רוצה, ואף אחד לא יכול לעשות אבל עדיין יש לכנסת נבחרת שמחליטה בסוף, ואני אומר לך שמה שצריך לעשות כאן זה להקים בית משפט לחוקה שייבחר על ידי הכנסת, ולא לתת לקומץ שופטים לעשות ככל העולה על רוחם.
לסיום, בכן ולא, צריך לקיים החלטות של בתי משפט?
בג"ץ צריך לקיים את החוקים כלשונם של...
So again, he's referring that the fact that the Supreme Court is a creation of the legislator, and so he's being asked, do we need to obey decisions of the Supreme Court? And he says, the Supreme Court cannot decide to cancel laws, and we have to obey law decisions of the. So we only have to obey the decisions of the Supreme Court, but not with regard to issues that are political or public. So the purpose of me bringing this recording, which I'm sure is horrible recording from the technical point of view, but the purpose is to validate the point that the Supreme Court is not in Israel, is not independent. It is constantly being threatened, and it is being threatened right now. It has been all the time. It's been curtailed. Now they're talking about what they call Chok HaHitgabrut, which means overriding the Supreme Court, passing a decision to override decisions by the Supreme Court. So where is the divide in Israel and Palestine? The divide is in two areas. The divide is between Israelis and Palestinians, because Palestinians are not citizens. They are not allowed to vote, and there is a constant conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians. But there is the other divide inside Israel, and that's between secular and Orthodox, between those who want to keep it as a Jewish state and wants to have religion and government at the same together, and those secular people who want to keep religion out of government, but they are not able to do it in a Jewish state. And that's where we will see constant conflict on these two divides, and they will be mixed. They will be using these two divides interchangeably. They're not necessarily separate. So the breakdown in Israel could come from the exterior, from Hezbollah, from Iran, from Syria and Hamas, and also internally, the collapse of the government itself, which we see right now. We see them not being able to create an election. The reason they're not able to create an election is because to create a government, is because Israel is not a democracy, and they're basically fighting between themselves on who will be the head of the government, who will control the whole thing, the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. But I don't see the collapse of the state of Israel on a physical, because it has a very strong military, and in my opinion, the military remains independent. Now, I would like to speak a little bit about Netanyahu's trial, because Netanyahu's trial is really emblematic of the whole system of Israel. Everything I spoke about, Netanyahu is being on trial for. The entire Israeli system, he is using has used his power all the time as executive and the legislative, and now controlling the Supreme Court in order to elevate his power. He's done it more than the other prime ministers before, but they've all done it, including starting from the beginning. It's just that he took it to a higher extreme. So in my opinion, when we see the continuation of the Netanyahu trial, we will see that the entire Israeli system, his defense is going to be, what do you want from me? I was given that authority and I acted within the authority. In a sense, he's saying I was given an authority to exploit the system. And now you're putting me on trial for it. And that's exactly what happening. He is on trial for one thing, is just as one example, as he appointed himself as the communication minister. And everybody would say, well, why is he communication minister? And then we realized that as a communication minister, he was able to give benefits to a communication company called Bezek, substantial benefits, and in return, he got positive coverage. So what he did was exactly within his power that was given to him. And that's what he's being tried on. And that's all because of lack of transparency. So which brings me to the last point, and that is that Israel really cannot make peace. It has a system that is inherently corrupt. It is not a democracy. It gives power to the president itself, to the prime minister, only the prime, not the president. President is a ceremonial, don't get mixed up. It is president and prime minister. Prime minister is the person with the power. So in order to make peace, I believe that the only solution is to create a common government with the Israelis and the Palestinian people together, a true democracy based on secular principle that would remove apartheid, remove the occupation, that would have a global view of the entire area of Israel, the West Bank, Gaza, and Jerusalem. And you know, it's not going to remove the Israeli government. It's not going to contradict the Israeli government or the Palestinian government, because I don't believe it's possible to do that. There are too strong of governments, especially on the Israeli government, the militarily, economically, politically, they are very strong. Also, the Hamas government is very strong militarily, economically, and the PA is becoming strong too. So it's going to be impossible to dismantle them. But I propose the creation of a common government that would be created side by side with the Israeli government and the Palestinian government, but independently of them, will work parallel, would be in a competition with them, but in a healthy competition, and would make peace. So I want to thank you so much. If you are able to prescribe or subscribe to this channel, that would be appreciated. And if you can tell your friends about it. I would, by the way, we do simulations to show how a common government could work. So thank you so much for joining. And next time I'll have some videos about how the common government could be created and how it could function. So thank you so much, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.